There's a moment in your life when you wake up and realize your standards are creating your destiny. Not your goals, not your dreams, not your hopes, your standards. What you're willing to accept and what you refuse to tolerate. And the truth is, most people never rise because they're living by standards they never consciously chose. They inherited them. They absorbed them. They settled into them. And then they wonder why nothing changes. You want to change your life. You raise your standards. Because the quality of your life is a direct reflection of the expectations you hold for yourself. Not when things are easy, but when everything is on the line. Standards are the invisible force shaping your identity, your behavior, your relationships, your health, your finances, your future. And the moment you decide, I'm done living at this level, I'm done accepting this version of myself, everything shifts. Not because the world suddenly becomes easier, but because you become stronger, clearer, more aligned. Listen, every transformation you've ever admired in someone else started with a standard. A moment where they said, this is no longer who I am. This is what I do now. This is what I demand of myself. That internal shift changes the external world. And if you've ever wondered why certain people seem unstoppable, it's not luck and it's not fate. It's that their standards are higher than their excuses. They demand more from themselves than anyone else ever could. Most people try to change their life by forcing new behaviors. But behavior follows identity, and identity follows standards. If your standard is, I'll try, you'll quit. If your standard is, I'll do it if it's convenient, you'll never grow. But if your standard becomes, I execute, I follow through, I don't negotiate with my old self, your entire psychology shifts. You stop waiting for inspiration and start creating momentum. You stop wishing and start doing. You stop breaking promises to yourself and start honoring your word like your life depends on it. Because in many ways, it does. Standards are powerful because they create certainty. They create clarity. They eliminate decision fatigue. When you have high standards, you don't have to ask yourself whether you'll show up. You just do. You don't wonder if you'll stay disciplined. You've already decided who you are. You don't question whether you'll rise above the noise. You've built yourself to operate at a different frequency. High standards create internal peace because you're no longer at war with your potential. But here's the hard truth. Raising your standards is uncomfortable. It means breaking patterns, letting go of people who reinforce your lower self, challenging your own stories, facing the areas of your life where you've been playing small. It means confronting the gap between who you are and who you know you can be. And that gap can feel painful. But that pain is growth. That pain is evolution. That pain is the price of becoming someone you respect. And the most dangerous standard of all is the one you don't even realize you've accepted, the standard of good enough. That kills more dreams than failure ever will, because good enough keeps you asleep. It keeps you numb. It keeps you from demanding the greatness that's already inside you. When you raise your standards, you disrupt the pattern. You ignite the fire. You reclaim your power. You want to know the real secret. Life will meet you at the level of your standards. Not sometimes. Not occasionally. Every time. If you expect average, you'll get average. If you expect excellence, you'll grow into someone capable of creating it. If you expect greatness, you'll stretch, you'll reach, you'll rise, you'll fall, and you'll rise again because that level demands it. So ask yourself right now, what have I been tolerating? Where have I lowered my standards to stay comfortable? Who have I allowed to influence me downward? What have I accepted that is no longer acceptable? What have I been telling myself that keeps me from stepping into who I know I'm meant to be? Because this is the moment. This is the line in the sand. This is where the old standards die and the new ones emerge. The standard of truth, the standard of discipline, the standard of consistency, the standard of courage, the standard of excellence, the standard of a person who refuses to live another day below the level of their potential. You don't need permission. You don't need validation. you need a decision. One powerful decision that says, from this moment on, this is who I am. This is what I demand of myself. This is my new standard. And when you make that decision with absolute certainty, life shifts with you. Your standards define your identity, and your identity determines every action you take, because the moment you set a standard, you're shaping the blueprint of who you are and who you're willing to become. Standards aren't just rules you follow. They are the invisible boundaries that determine what you allow into your life and what you refuse to tolerate. Most people never understand how deeply standards shape their destiny because they believe change begins with motivation or willpower, but real transformation begins when you shift what you expect from yourself at the deepest level. When your standards rise, your decisions rise. When your standards rise, your behaviors elevate. When your standards rise, your entire internal world reorganizes around a higher identity. And identity is the ultimate driver, because people do not act in accordance with their goals. They act in accordance with who they believe they are. Think about it. If your standard is to be someone who always follows through, then even when you're tired, discouraged, or overwhelmed, you show up. Not because it's easy, but because it's who you are. If your standard is excellence, you don't cut corners, you don't settle, you don't accept mediocrity from yourself. If your standard is integrity, you don't break promises, not to others and not to yourself. Standards create a sense of inner alignment that becomes stronger than external pressure. They become the internal compass that guides your decisions, even when emotions fluctuate and circumstances shift. Without high standards, you operate on feelings, and feelings are unstable. With high standards, you operate on identity, and identity is unshakable. Most people's standards are shaped by their environment, not by conscious choice. They accept the level of health they see around them, the level of effort they were raised with, the level of discipline that feels comfortable rather than the level required for greatness. And over time, they start believing that this is just who they are, when in reality, it's who they've practiced being. But the moment you raise your standards, you rewrite that practice. You begin to interrupt old patterns, and your brain starts wiring a new version of you. It's not the big decisions that define you. It's the standard you live by every day, the non-negotiables that shape your choices without you even thinking about them. If your standard becomes, I don't quit, then quitting isn't an option. Not because someone is watching, but because it contradicts the identity you've chosen. If your standard becomes, I take care of my body, then movement, nutrition, and energy become part of your lifestyle, not a temporary habit. If your standard becomes, I honor my word, then every commitment carries weight and meaning, and you build confidence, because confidence is the byproduct of keeping promises to yourself. Every time you keep a promise, your identity strengthens. Every time you break a promise, your identity weakens. That's how powerful standards are. They either reinforce the person you want to be, or they reinforce the person you're trying to leave behind. Your standards influence everything: how you speak to yourself, how you manage your time, how you handle stress, how you pursue goals, how you treat others, how you respond to setbacks. When your standards are low, you negotiate with excuses. When your standards are high, you eliminate excuses. When your standards are low, you accept the path of least resistance. When your standards are high, you choose the path of growth even when it's uncomfortable. And growth is always uncomfortable because it challenges the patterns your mind has relied on for years. But high standards require that challenge, because without discomfort, there is no expansion, and without expansion, there is no transformation. Raising your standards isn't about perfection, it's about intention. It's about deciding the level at which you will live, think, act, and respond. When you set a new standard, you create a new identity, and the identity pulls you toward a new reality. You stop trying to force yourself to change and instead begin to embody the change. That's why people who truly elevate their standards don't rely on motivation. They rely on identity-driven action. They don't act because they feel like it. They act because it's who they are. And that shift is what separates temporary progress from lasting transformation. When your standards rise, your world rises with them. Opportunities appear because you're operating at a higher level. Relationships shift because you no longer tolerate anything that pulls you backward. Your energy changes because discipline becomes a source of power rather than pressure. And every day, as you live according to those standards, your identity grows stronger, your confidence grows deeper, and your life begins to reflect the person you have decided to become. The moment you refuse to tolerate the old version of yourself, you create a new destiny, because transformation doesn't begin with a new plan or a new opportunity. It begins with a moment of absolute refusal. A moment when something inside you says, I can't live like this anymore. I won't accept this level of energy, this level of confidence, this level of existence. That refusal becomes the spark that ignites your evolution. Most people think change happens slowly over months or years, but real change begins in an instant, a psychological breaking point where the old identity collapses. That's the moment when your future is rewritten, not because the world around you changes, but because who you're willing to be changes internally. The old version of you is built from habits, patterns, fears, wounds, beliefs, and stories you've carried for years. You stay attached to it because it's familiar, even when it's painful. Humans will hold on to suffering if it's predictable. But the second you decide the old version of you is no longer acceptable, you break the spell. You interrupt the cycle. You stop giving power to the narratives that once kept you small. That refusal becomes the psychological doorway to a higher standard of living. And once that door opens, your thoughts shift, your behavior shifts, your energy shifts, and life begins to reflect the identity you're stepping into rather than the one you're leaving behind. Refusing the old version of yourself means disrupting patterns you've lived with for years. It means confronting the excuses you've used to protect your comfort. It means acknowledging the ways you've limited yourself, the places you've settled, the potential you've ignored. This level of honesty is uncomfortable, which is why most people avoid it. They fear the discomfort more than they fear the consequences of staying the same. But the moment you refuse to tolerate the old you, discomfort becomes a signal of growth, not danger. You begin to reinterpret the sensations that once held you back. Fear becomes a sign of alignment. Resistance becomes a sign of expansion. Your nervous system starts rewiring itself to support who you're becoming rather than who you've been. This moment of refusal is powerful because it activates personal responsibility. Not blame, not guilt, responsibility. Responsibility says, I may not have chosen everything that happened to me, but I choose what I do next. And that choice is where destiny is created. You stop waiting for external circumstances to shift. You stop hoping for someone to save you. You stop expecting your environment to give you courage. Instead, you generate change from within. You become the source, the driver, the cause. Life doesn't happen to you anymore. It responds to you. The old you reacted to life. The new you leads it. When you stop tolerating the old version of yourself, you stop negotiating with limitations. You stop entertaining the stories that say you're not ready, not capable, not enough. You stop validating the patterns that drain your energy. You start questioning the beliefs that once defined you. You stop indulging in the habits that kept you stuck. And for the first time, you feel the weight of possibility. You realize that the gap between where you are and where you want to be is not a lack of ability, it's a lack of alignment with your future self. The second you align with that higher identity, your destiny begins to accelerate. This shift is not loud. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's a quiet internal vow. Sometimes it's a breaking point where you hit the emotional threshold. Sometimes it's a moment of clarity where you finally see yourself truthfully. But every powerful transformation in human history started this way, not with motivation, but with a refusal to stay small, a refusal to repeat old cycles, a refusal to accept anything less than the life you know you're capable of living. When you release the old version of yourself, you also release the environment and people who fed that version. You release the thought patterns that shaped it. You release the behaviors that reinforced it. And in that space of release, something new emerges, a version of you that operates with intention, discipline, clarity, and purpose. You begin to set standards instead of surrendering to circumstances. You begin to create momentum instead of waiting for inspiration. You begin to trust yourself because you're no longer betraying your own potential. Every breakthrough begins with a breaking point. And the breaking point is simply the moment you say, this ends here. That decision has power because it creates identity shift. And identity shift creates destiny shift. The old you wanted change but feared the price. The new you understands that the price of staying the same is far greater. And once you see that truth, you can't unsee it. You rise because you must. You grow because it's required. You evolve because the old version of you can no longer lead the life you're stepping into.